The German-led invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was not an isolated military campaign, but the culmination of a decade of ideological fanaticism, geopolitical maneuvering, and strategic miscalculations. The roots of the operation lay deep within Adolf Hitler's vision for Europe, defined in part by his obsession with racial hierarchy and his desire for Lebensraum, living space, for the German people in the East. The Soviet Union, with its vast expanses, fertile land, and ideological opposition to National Socialism, became both a target of conquest and a perceived existential threat. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, temporarily masked the antagonism between the two powers. Yet from the outset, Hitler viewed the agreement as a tactical move, not a durable peace. While German forces swept through Western Europe in a series of stunning victories in 1940, the Eastern question loomed large in the Führer's mind. By December of that year, Hitler had signed Directive 21, Barbarossa, ordering the preparation for a full-scale invasion of the USSR, set for the following summer. The speed and decisiveness of the Blitzkrieg in France had only emboldened his belief in a rapid conquest of Soviet territory. Germany's allies, including Italy, Hungary, Romania, and Finland, had mixed motivations for supporting or participating in the Eastern Campaign. Some sought territorial revisions, others ideological alignment, and a few were drawn in by diplomatic pressure. While the Wehrmacht was at the height of its power, doubts remained within the German high command about the scale of the operation. The Soviet Union was vast, its manpower immense, and the terrain unpredictable. Intelligence estimates were uneven. Some reports underestimated the Red Army's size and capabilities. Others warned of the logistical nightmare that would follow a deep push into Soviet territory. Public sentiment in Germany was shaped by propaganda that portrayed the Soviet Union as a corrupt, chaotic, and backward regime. The invasion was framed as a crusade against Bolshevism, and the rhetoric merged racial contempt with anti-communist zeal. In the USSR, although the Stalinist regime had purged much of its military leadership in the late 1930s and committed severe internal repression, it had also been preparing for a potential confrontation. Soviet industrial policy, concentrated in the East and increasingly geared toward military production, reflected a recognition of looming conflict. The geopolitical context of 1941 was marked by the shifting alliances and collapsing neutrality of many European states. Britain, though resilient, stood largely alone in the West after France's defeat. The United States remained officially neutral, though increasingly aligned with Britain through material support and diplomatic coordination. Stalin, despite warnings from intelligence sources and his own agents abroad, clung to the belief that Hitler would not attack while Britain remained unconquered. He misread German intentions, suspecting that military buildups along the border were aimed at pressuring him into further concessions, not an outright war. Both sides miscalculated. Hitler envisioned a campaign lasting no more than a few months. He believed the Soviet regime would collapse like a house of cards, undermined by internal discontent and military incompetence. Stalin, meanwhile, underestimated the imminence and scale of the attack, dismissing multiple reports of impending invasion even in the days before German forces struck. These mutual errors would prove catastrophic in the months ahead. As Germany's panzers revved their engines on the eastern frontier, the ideological and strategic framework for the invasion was set. Operation Barbarossa was not merely a military gamble, it was a war of annihilation. For Hitler, it was both a racial and political war, aimed not only at defeating an enemy army, but at dismantling a state, exterminating its leadership, and exploiting its resources. For the Soviet Union, the stakes were equally existential. Though unprepared in many respects, its survival would hinge not only on military resistance, but on the resilience of its people and the vastness of its land. The stage was thus set for the largest military operation in human history. What followed would reshape the course of the Second World War and define the geopolitical contours of the post-war world. The conditions leading up to the invasion explain not only why the Germans struck when they did, but also help illuminate why, despite early triumphs, their campaign would ultimately fall short. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht launched its most ambitious military campaign to date, Operation Barbarossa. The initial assault involved over 3 million Axis soldiers spread across a vast 1,800-mile front, supported by 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 aircraft. The invasion was divided into 3 army groups, North, Center, and South. Each had distinct objectives, capturing Leningrad, Moscow, and the resource-rich regions of Ukraine, respectively. This division of forces was intended to bring swift and total collapse to Soviet resistance through overwhelming force and rapid maneuver. The first hours of the attack were devastating for the Soviet side. German aircraft achieved near-complete air superiority by destroying over 1,200 Soviet planes on the ground. The Red Army was caught by surprise, its units poorly positioned and command structures in disarray. Soviet border defenses, such as the Stalin Line, were outdated and undermanned, offering little resistance to the advancing panzers. German armored spearheads drove deep into Soviet territory, encircling and annihilating entire divisions within days. The blitzkrieg that had shattered France seemed equally effective against the Red Army. In the north, Army Group North advanced swiftly through the Baltic states, driving toward Leningrad. Army Group South, with assistance from Romanian and Hungarian allies, began pushing into Ukraine, targeting key cities such as Kiev and Odessa. But it was Army Group Center, moving through Belarus toward Smolensk and Moscow, that bore the brunt of the initial offensive. The rapid encirclements around Minsk and Bialystok captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, further straining the Red Army's ability to regroup and respond. German commanders were initially euphoric. The Wehrmacht's early success exceeded even their optimistic projections. Soviet communications collapsed across wide sectors, and panic spread among commanders and civilians alike. Stalin, reportedly stunned by the attack, withdrew into a brief period of silence, uncertain how to proceed. Nonetheless, he soon regained control and ordered a general mobilization, framing the conflict as a patriotic war for survival. This rhetorical shift marked a critical psychological moment in Soviet resistance. Despite early victories, the German advance began encountering unforeseen challenges. The vastness of Soviet territory stretched supply lines thin. Roads turned to dust in the summer heat, and rail networks, built to a different gauge, required conversion to German standards before they could be used efficiently. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and logistical confusion began to slow the pace of advance. Units often outpaced their support elements, leaving frontline troops vulnerable to counterattacks and attrition. Another emerging problem was the scale of Soviet manpower. Though stunned and uncoordinated at the outset, the Red Army retained a staggering capacity for regeneration. New formations were raised behind the front at an alarming rate. Civilian militias, conscripts, and reserve units were thrown into the line to delay German movements, often at tremendous cost. Yet even these piecemeal efforts began to complicate German plans. At the same time, internal debates simmered within the German command structure. Some generals, such as Heinz Guderian, advocated a concentrated push toward Moscow, arguing that capturing the Soviet capital would shatter enemy morale and control. Others, including Hitler himself, prioritized the flanks, securing Ukraine and Leningrad to deny the Soviets economic resources. This strategic indecision would have long-term implications for the coherence of the campaign. On the Soviet side, command began to stabilize as Stalin consolidated control. Despite purges that had decimated the officer corps in previous years, a new generation of commanders, some inexperienced but tenacious, began to emerge. Marshal Zhukov would soon play a central role in the defense of Moscow, though at this early stage his influence was still limited. Nevertheless, defensive lines were hastily thrown up around key cities, and industrial evacuations to the east were initiated to preserve Soviet production capacity. Propaganda on both sides intensified. In Germany, the invasion was depicted as a righteous crusade against Bolshevism and Slavic inferiority. In the Soviet Union, it became a war for the motherland, with appeals to Russian patriotism, cultural heritage, and national survival. This reframing of the conflict would prove decisive in galvanizing Soviet society, even as entire cities fell and millions were displaced. As the German offensive pressed deeper, The terrain itself began to play a role. Forests, rivers, and marshes complicated mechanized movement, particularly for tanks and support vehicles. In some sectors, Soviet troops resorted to scorched earth tactics, destroying bridges, railways, crops, and entire settlements to deny resources to the enemy. These actions slowed the German advance and increased the logistical burden. By mid-July 1941, the initial shock of Barbarossa had passed, and a new, more complex phase of the war had begun. The German High Command still believed in ultimate victory, but the campaign was already drifting from its original timetable. Soviet resistance was harder, deeper, and more resilient than anticipated. The road to Moscow remained open, but the path would not be as swift or bloodless as Hitler had imagined. As the summer of 1941 progressed, the grand strategy behind Operation Barbarossa began to reveal its internal contradictions and dangerous overconfidence. At the heart of the German plan was the belief that the Soviet Union could be defeated quickly, ideally within 10 to 12 weeks. This assumption was rooted not only in the Wehrmacht's previous lightning campaigns in Western Europe, but also in a deep underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity, political cohesion, and military resilience. The logistical preparations reflected this thinking. Supply lines were optimized for a short, rapid advance, not for a prolonged war over thousands of kilometers. The initial strategic goals were ambitious. Army Group North was to seize Leningrad, cutting off the Baltic Sea and threatening Soviet access to Scandinavia. Army Group Center was aimed at Moscow, the political and transportation heart of the Soviet Union. Army Group South was tasked with capturing Ukraine and its agricultural and industrial assets, including the Dnieper Basin and the Donetsk coal region. While all three objectives were critical, disagreements soon emerged among German leaders over prioritization. Field Marshal von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, pushed for a direct thrust toward Moscow. In contrast, Hitler increasingly viewed Ukraine's resources as essential for sustaining the German war machine. This divergence led to conflicting orders. In early August, despite strong momentum toward Moscow, Hitler redirected Panzer Groups 2 and 3 southward to assist in encircling Soviet forces around Kiev. This delay would prove pivotal, though the resulting encirclement was a tactical triumph, capturing over 600,000 Soviet troops in what became the largest encirclement battle in history. It shifted focus away from the Central Axis and consumed valuable time. By the time the advance on Moscow resumed in October, the window for a swift victory had narrowed drastically. The German logistical network struggled to adapt. Roads in the Soviet Union were few and poorly maintained. The lack of all-weather surfaces meant that even moderate rain turned transport routes into quagmires. The rail gauge difference between Soviet and German tracks further compounded the problem. German engineers worked feverishly to convert tracks, but progress was slow, and the supply lines lagged far behind the front. Ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies became increasingly scarce, forcing commanders to ration and prioritize, often at the expense of mobility. Compounding these difficulties was the Wehrmacht's reliance on horse-drawn transport. Despite its mechanized image, large portions of the German army still depended on horses for logistics. The vast distances and poor infrastructure rapidly exhausted men and animals alike. Vehicles broke down frequently due to overuse and lack of maintenance. Spare parts were limited, and fuel convoys became targets for Soviet raids. German supply officers began to issue dire warnings. The army was outrunning its capacity to sustain itself. Meanwhile, Soviet industrial evacuation efforts were gaining momentum. Whole factories were dismantled and transported by rail to the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia. Although chaotic and costly, this extraordinary effort preserved a significant portion of the USSR's industrial base. In time, it would enable the Red Army to rebuild and rearm on an unprecedented scale. While German planners had anticipated the destruction of Soviet industry, they failed to account for its strategic relocation beyond the reach of Luftwaffe bombers and advancing ground forces. Soviet mobilization continued at breakneck speed. Millions of new conscripts were drafted, including teenagers and the elderly. Despite high desertion rates and inadequate training, sheer numbers began to slow the German advance. New formations were thrown into battle as soon as they arrived, often with minimal equipment. Yet the psychological effect on German troops was profound. Every Soviet loss seemed to be replaced by more soldiers, more artillery, more resistance. What was supposed to be a war of swift annihilation had become a war of attrition. In Berlin, optimism began to fade. Hitler's confidence remained unshaken in public, but within the high command concerns mounted. The original plan to destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper had failed. Soviet forces had suffered catastrophic losses, but the state had not collapsed. Intelligence analysts struggled to explain the continuous appearance of new Soviet units. Morale among German soldiers, high in June, began to erode under the pressure of relentless combat, fatigue, and an increasingly hostile environment. Propaganda efforts intensified to maintain discipline and ideological fervor. German soldiers were reminded of their mission to eradicate Bolshevism and protect European civilization. But in reality, the brutality of the campaign, mass executions, starvation policies, and scorched earth tactics began to blur any remaining distinction between military necessity and ideological extermination. The German army found itself not only fighting soldiers, but policing vast hostile territories filled with partisans and civilians caught in the crossfire. The strategic picture by late summer was becoming more ambiguous. Though territorial gains were massive and casualty ratios still favored the Germans, the momentum was slowing. Soviet counterattacks, while often poorly coordinated, grew in frequency and scale. The Wehrmacht was fighting deeper and deeper into enemy territory without securing a decisive victory. The leadership continued to believe that one more blow, perhaps the fall of Moscow, would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. But the longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became that the original assumptions behind Barbarossa were dangerously flawed. The campaign was no longer a sprint. It was transforming into a grinding, multi-front struggle that the German army was neither trained nor equipped to endure. Strategic overreach, logistical collapse, and the tenacity of Soviet resistance were beginning to undermine the very foundations of the German war effort. The question was no longer whether the Red Army could be destroyed. It was whether Germany could sustain its offensive before time, terrain, and weather turned against it. By early September 1941, the German advance had begun to slow noticeably across the entire Eastern Front. The initial shock of Operation Barbarossa had worn off, and although German forces continued to make gains, the tempo of operations was visibly reduced. The Wehrmacht, still tactically superior in many engagements, faced mounting delays, growing resistance, and a strategic picture that was becoming increasingly complex. The initial confidence that the Soviet Union would collapse under pressure had given way to a grudging acknowledgement that the Red Army, though battered and often disorganized, would not surrender easily. In the north, Army Group North approached the outskirts of Leningrad, where the terrain and urban defenses presented a new kind of challenge. Instead of continuing the costly frontal assault, Hitler ordered a siege. Thus began one of the most devastating blockades in modern history. Leningrad, a city of nearly 3 million inhabitants, was encircled in September. German and Finnish forces established a cordon, hoping to starve the city into submission. The decision to avoid direct confrontation reflected the overstretched state of German logistics and the fear of high casualties in urban combat. But it also signaled a shift. The war was no longer a matter of quick victories. It was becoming a long, attritional struggle. To the south, Army Group South faced fierce Soviet resistance around Kiev. Here, the German High Command launched one of the largest encirclement operations of the war, committing vast armored formations to envelop the Soviet southwestern front. The result was a major German success, the capture of Kiev and the encirclement of over 500,000 Soviet troops. Yet, this operational triumph came at a cost. It diverted critical panzer units away from the central front and delayed the push toward Moscow by several weeks, a delay that would prove crucial as autumn rains and winter frost loomed. Army Group Center, meanwhile, was temporarily halted after the Battle of Smolensk. The Red Army had mounted a tenacious defense, and while German forces eventually broke through, they did not destroy the bulk of Soviet troops. Moreover, the delay at Smolensk further complicated the logistical situation. Supplies were bottlenecked, fuel convoys struggled to keep up, and thousands of vehicles were sidelined due to mechanical failure or lack of spare parts. German commanders on the ground began to warn that time was running out. The Red Army, despite suffering catastrophic losses, continued to rebuild. Soviet industrial mobilization was now in full swing. Dozens of critical factories producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition had been successfully relocated to the Urals and beyond. Within months, these plants resumed production, pumping out thousands of T-34 tanks and Yak fighter planes. Soviet manpower was effectively limitless. The state could call up entire age groups in rapid succession, and despite rudimentary training and equipment, these forces provided depth and continuity to the Soviet defense. Furthermore, the Soviet command structure, which had been paralyzed in the first weeks of the war, began to stabilize. Stalin granted more operational autonomy to field commanders, allowing experienced officers like Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev to exert greater control. Intelligence gathering improved, and Soviet radio interception began to provide valuable insights into German operations. While Soviet counterattacks often failed tactically, they served to disrupt German plans and force delays. The psychological impact on German troops was growing. The belief in a quick and glorious campaign was steadily eroded by endless marches, unexpected counterattacks, and the scale of the fighting. Casualties were mounting, and reinforcements from the West could not fully replace losses. Some units had suffered over 50% attrition. Morale began to slip, and desertions, though still rare, increased. Letters from the front revealed a grim shift in tone, from enthusiastic to weary and disillusioned. Another critical factor was the civilian population. In occupied areas, German forces implemented brutal policies, mass executions, deportations, and reprisals against suspected partisans. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS death squads, followed behind the front lines, exterminating Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies. These atrocities not only constituted some of the darkest chapters of the war, but also fueled Soviet propaganda and galvanized local resistance. Partisan activity in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic regions intensified, forcing German units to divert resources to rear-area security. In the skies, the Luftwaffe's initial dominance was being challenged. The Soviet Air Force, initially devastated, began to recover. Aircraft losses were still high, but the quality of Soviet pilots and the performance of newer models improved steadily. German pilots noted with frustration the increasing frequency of Soviet air activity, particularly in the central sector. Luftwaffe logistics, like those of the Army, were under strain. Airfields had to be built and rebuilt as the front shifted, and maintenance crews struggled to keep aircraft operational. The weather, too, began to turn. By late September, the skies grew heavy with clouds, and the first autumn rains turned roads into impassable mud. The infamous Rasputitsa, the seasonal slush, brought German vehicle columns to a crawl. Supply trucks became mired, artillery could not be moved, and tanks stalled in deep puddles. Infantry advanced knee-deep in muck, exposed to the elements and exhausted by the strain. The Blitzkrieg model, based on speed and mobility, was beginning to unravel. Despite all this, Hitler believed that a final offensive aimed at Moscow would still bring victory. Operation Typhoon, the planned strike on the Soviet capital, was given priority. Panzer groups were redirected once more to the center, and preparations were rushed. Yet even as the Wehrmacht geared up for this final push, many officers doubted its feasibility. Time, weather, and resistance were all aligning against the Germans. The first engagements of Operation Barbarossa had delivered immense destruction to the Red Army, but they had failed to deliver a knockout blow. What remained was a grinding, complex campaign against a tenacious and regenerating enemy. As autumn deepened and the clouds of winter gathered, the war on the Eastern Front was transforming, no longer a campaign of movement, but one of endurance, adaptation, and survival. The fatal flaw of the German plan was becoming clear. It was designed for victory in weeks, not war in years. By October 1941, the Wehrmacht had reorganized its focus toward the capture of Moscow, launching Operation Typhoon, Germany's final and most determined bid to bring down the Soviet Union before the onset of winter. The stakes were enormous. Hitler and the OKH believed that seizing the Soviet capital would sever command structures, demoralize the population, and deliver the long-awaited collapse of Soviet resistance. Moscow was more than a symbolic target. It was the nerve center of Soviet governance, transportation, and communication. But the timing was perilous. The German army was already fatigued, its logistics frayed, and the weather rapidly deteriorating. Despite these difficulties, Operation Typhoon began with impressive tactical results. In early October, German forces executed a series of large-scale encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk, west of Moscow. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were trapped and captured, further degrading the Red Army's strength. The road to Moscow appeared open. German propaganda declared that victory was imminent. Newspapers in Berlin printed headlines proclaiming the imminent fall of the Soviet capital. But on the ground, the picture was far less clear. The German troops pressing forward were exhausted, under-equipped for cold weather, and operating far beyond their logistical limits. Supplies were rationed strictly. Ammunition, food, and winter clothing were insufficient. Mechanical failures were common. Troops advanced with frostbitten hands and inadequate boots, sleeping in open fields or ruined villages. As German columns neared Moscow, their pace slowed dramatically. Resistance stiffened. Soviet defensive lines, hastily organized but reinforced by new recruits and units brought in from Siberia, began to hold. These reinforcements were made possible by a critical development. Stalin had received intelligence indicating that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East in the immediate future. This freed up several elite divisions stationed near Manchuria. These fresh, well-equipped units were redeployed by rail to Moscow, arriving just as the German advance was reaching its final limits. Soviet defenses were further bolstered by the creation of deep defensive belts, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified urban positions, all supported by a reorganized command structure under General Zhukov. The weather continued to deteriorate. Heavy rains in October worsened the Rasputitsa, turning roads into rivers of mud. Trucks and tanks bogged down for days. Infantry waded through sludge, unable to maintain formations. Horses collapsed under the weight of overloaded carts. Engineers attempted to lay corduroy roads, planks over mud, to allow passage, but progress was excruciatingly slow. German units were stranded, vulnerable to Soviet artillery and counterattacks. The advantage of mobility, central to the Blitzkrieg doctrine, was now effectively neutralized. Even so, German troops pushed to the outskirts of Moscow by late November. In some sectors, they were less than 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. German forward observers claimed they could see the spires of the city. But the advance came at a steep cost. Casualties soared. Whole divisions were reduced to skeletal formations. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and operating from makeshift airfields, could no longer provide consistent support. Fuel shortages became critical. Panzer units were immobilized for lack of gasoline, and artillery pieces were abandoned when horses died or roads collapsed. Inside Moscow, panic briefly gripped the population. Thousands of civilians were evacuated, and government offices began preparing for relocation. Yet Stalin refused to leave the capital. His decision to remain and broadcast messages of defiance became a rallying point for Soviet morale. Factories in the city continued to operate under blackout conditions. Reinforcements streamed in, including militia units composed of workers, students, and retirees. The defense of Moscow was not only a military endeavor, it became a symbol of national resistance. By early December, German commanders faced a grim reality. Their forces were at the end of their strength, and winter had arrived in full force. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Vehicles froze solid overnight. Weapons jammed, lubricants congealed, and frostbite spread rapidly among troops lacking proper clothing. The Wehrmacht had not prepared for a winter campaign, assuming the war would end before cold weather set in. Now they were entrenched in positions they could not hold, in weather they could not withstand. On December 5th, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Soviet troops, many equipped with winter uniforms and supported by fresh reserves and superior knowledge of the terrain, struck along the entire front near Moscow. German lines buckled under the pressure. Units were forced into hasty retreats. Entire corps fell back tens of kilometers to avoid encirclement. Hitler issued orders forbidding retreat, but many commanders ignored them to avoid annihilation. The German offensive had reached its high watermark. The Soviet counteroffensive did not destroy the Wehrmacht or liberate occupied territories, but it marked a decisive shift in the conflict. For the first time, the German advance had not only stalled, it had been repelled. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. Morale within the Red Army surged, while German troops endured one of the most brutal winters in military history without the supplies or shelter to withstand it. The failure to capture Moscow was not merely a missed objective, it was a strategic catastrophe. It marked the end of the Blitzkrieg as a viable strategy in the East. The war, once envisioned as a swift campaign, was now a grinding war of attrition. The German leadership, still clinging to visions of victory, was confronted with the harsh truth. The Soviet Union could not be broken by rapid assault, and the road to conquest was longer, bloodier, and more uncertain than anyone in Berlin had dared to imagine. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought the German campaign in the Soviet Union to its most dangerous and fragile point. Following the failed assault on Moscow and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht found itself overextended, undersupplied, and rapidly losing the strategic initiative. What had begun in June as a war of swift conquest had transformed into a brutal test of endurance, in which terrain, temperature, and time had become as formidable as the Red Army itself. The dream of a quick victory was buried under snow and frozen in the mud of the Eastern Front. Across the front lines, the German army dug in to hold what ground it could. Makeshift defenses, trenches, frozen bunkers, field fortifications were established wherever the soil could be broken. Units were often isolated, low on food and fuel, and exposed to continuous Soviet harassment. With inadequate winter gear, frostbite became endemic. In some formations, more men were rendered combat ineffective by the cold than by enemy fire. Supplies from Germany trickled in sporadically, and entire battalions went days without hot food or proper ammunition. Soviet forces, despite enormous losses in the previous months, had turned the tide. Stalin's gamble to defend Moscow had paid off, and his confidence surged. Red Army formations now moved with greater coordination and were buoyed by the morale boost of repelling the invader. Soviet tactics began to adapt. Where frontal assaults had previously led to disastrous losses, the use of mobile groups, infiltration, and night attacks became more frequent. Artillery concentrations were refined, and the integration of armor, infantry, and air support improved slowly but steadily. In January 1942, the Soviets launched a series of offensives across the front, including their Zhev Vyazma operation west of Moscow, and renewed pushes in the north and south. While many of these offensives suffered from overextension and poor planning, they succeeded in putting German formations on the defensive and preventing any coordinated attempt at a renewed German offensive. The Red Army, now replenished by industrial production from the relocated eastern factories, was producing thousands of T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and reliable firearms. The material balance was beginning to tilt. The fighting reached a new level of savagery. Villages changed hands multiple times. Civilians caught between lines were often massacred or deported. Entire towns were destroyed in artillery exchanges. In occupied areas, the German policy of reprisals against partisans and civilians escalated. Tens of thousands were executed in suspected partisan regions, while forced labor and deportations became routine. These brutal policies only deepened local resistance, giving rise to a massive and decentralized partisan movement that would tie down German troops for the remainder of the war. Meanwhile, the strain on German logistics became critical. The vast distances from Germany's industrial centers, the destruction of infrastructure by retreating Soviet forces, and the weather all contributed to an increasingly unstable supply situation. Ammunition and fuel were prioritized for armored units in key sectors, leaving infantry divisions undersupplied. Hospitals overflowed with frostbite victims. Equipment maintenance was nearly impossible in sub-zero conditions, and spare parts were in short supply. German high command attempted to stabilize the front. Reinforcements were called in from France and the Balkans. Units were rotated when possible, though most divisions remained in place. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now struggled to provide adequate support. Soviet aircraft increasingly contested the skies, and the logistical burden of flying in the harsh winter weather further degraded German air capabilities. Among the German leadership, cracks began to appear. Field commanders such as Guderian, von Bock, and von Kluge expressed open concern about the state of their forces. Requests for tactical withdrawals were denied by Hitler, who insisted on holding every meter of captured ground. His refusal to permit flexible defense led to further losses, as exposed salients became traps for Soviet breakthroughs. The command structure, already rigid, became more reactive and less adaptable under Hitler's growing micromanagement. The Soviet command, while emboldened, also suffered from overreach. Several winter offensives stretched supply lines too far, leading to high casualties and little territorial gain. Nonetheless, the strategic picture had changed. The Red Army had survived the onslaught, blunted the enemy's main effort, and begun to push back. Soviet planning for 1942 increasingly focused on coordinated, large-scale operations designed to liberate key regions and exploit German weaknesses. In Germany, the failure of Barbarossa was not yet openly acknowledged, but the public mood began to shift. Propaganda emphasized the heroism of German soldiers facing Asiatic hordes in brutal conditions. Newspapers avoided mention of the stalled front, while families received letters in colder and more fatalistic tones. Winter relief campaigns were organized to send supplies to soldiers, but these made little practical difference on the front lines. The image of swift, triumphant war had faded. By the end of March 1942, the front stabilized into a tenuous line stretching from Leningrad in the north to the Sea of Azov in the south. The Wehrmacht retained control of vast swaths of Soviet territory, but had failed to destroy the Red Army or seize the political centers of the Soviet Union. The Soviet state remained intact, its industrial capacity growing and its military learning from every battle. The battle for Moscow and the months that followed exposed the core flaws of German strategy: a profound underestimation of the Soviet Union's resilience, over-reliance on speed and surprise, and a logistical system incapable of sustaining a prolonged campaign in the East. Hitler's rigid leadership style, while effective during rapid offensives, now posed a liability. The war in the East was no longer a matter of quick victory. It had become a grinding struggle, and the momentum had begun, however gradually, to shift in favor of the defenders. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, the German High Command sought to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The failure to capture Moscow had deeply shaken Hitler's strategic confidence, and with the Wehrmacht's limitations now exposed, the German leadership pivoted toward a new objective: the Southern Soviet Union. This shift marked the beginning of Operation Blue, Fall Blau, designed not to topple the Soviet regime directly, but to cripple its war-making capacity by seizing vital oil fields in the Caucasus and cutting off the Volga River at Stalingrad. The new plan reflected a more cautious approach on paper, focused on economic targets rather than symbolic ones. The Wehrmacht was to drive southeast from Ukraine, push across the Don River, take Stalingrad to secure the flank, and then fan out toward the oil-rich regions of Maikop, Grozny, and ultimately Baku. Hitler believed this would strangle the Soviet war machine by denying it energy resources while providing fuel for the German military. Yet, even before the campaign began, the same flaws that had plagued Barbarossa resurfaced: overly ambitious planning, underestimation of Soviet capabilities, and deep disagreements within the command structure. The Red Army, for its part, had not been idle. The disastrous winter had prompted deep introspection and a series of reforms. Commanders were rotated, unit structures revised, and training programs intensified. Soviet factories, now fully operational far from the front, produced thousands of T-34s and Il-2 ground attack aircraft, giving Soviet forces both quantity and improving quality. Partisan activity behind German lines reached new heights, disrupting railroads, ambushing convoys, and draining German resources through constant rear-area skirmishes. Civilians played an increasing role in intelligence gathering and sabotage, making the occupied territories a hostile and unpredictable environment. As Operation Blue commenced in June 1942, German forces initially made rapid progress. Soviet defenses in the southern sector were less concentrated, and the Red Army had expected another drive toward Moscow. German spearheads advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, recapturing Kharkov and pushing deep into the Don Basin. The Luftwaffe provided strong air support, and the Soviet response was fractured, struggling to match the Wehrmacht's concentrated thrust. Hitler, encouraged by the early success, altered the plan mid-campaign, splitting Army Group South into two separate commands, Army Group A to advance into the Caucasus and Army Group B to take Stalingrad. This decision fatally diluted the German effort. The split placed a tremendous strain on logistics. Two massive offensives now had to be supported simultaneously across growing distances over a crumbling infrastructure. The further the Wehrmacht moved into the Soviet South, the more vulnerable its flanks became. The Soviet High Command, under Stalin's increasingly professionalized Stavka, saw the weakness and prepared accordingly. Rather than commit to a full defense of the Caucasus or the Don, Soviet forces were ordered to delay, disrupt, and bleed the Germans as they extended themselves deeper into hostile terrain. By August, German troops reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The city itself had limited strategic value in traditional military terms, but its position on the Volga made it a key transport hub, and its name, bearing that of Stalin, turned it into a symbolic prize. Hitler became obsessed with capturing it, and the Wehrmacht committed increasing numbers of troops and resources to the assault. Street-by-street fighting began in earnest, consuming entire divisions in brutal, close-quarters combat. The Luftwaffe flattened much of the city, turning it into a maze of rubble where Soviet defenders, militia, conscripts, and veterans alike waged a desperate resistance. The battle rapidly devolved into a quagmire. German commanders, including General Paulus of the Sixth Army, found themselves trapped in a battle of attrition for which the Wehrmacht was ill-suited. Soviet defenders, under General Schweikhoff, fought with ferocity, using urban terrain to negate German superiority in armor and coordination. Every building became a fortress, every basement a bunker. Soviet snipers, sappers, and raiding parties inflicted continuous losses. Meanwhile, reserves were quietly gathered behind the lines for a counterstroke. Elsewhere, Army Group A pressed into the Caucasus but found its advance slowing. The terrain, mountainous, narrow, and heavily defended, proved far more difficult than anticipated. Supply lines stretched thin over poor roads, and local resistance intensified. German units found themselves bogged down in a region they could not easily control, hundreds of kilometers from their supply bases. While initial gains were made, including the symbolic capture of Mount Elbrus, the deeper goal of securing the oil fields remained elusive. Back in Stalingrad, by October, the Sixth Army was exhausted, having taken enormous casualties and gained only partial control of the city. German supply lines were vulnerable, guarded by thinly held flanks composed of Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. These units, often poorly equipped and lacking anti-tank weapons, became the weak points in an otherwise hardened German front. The Soviet High Command took note. In November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement maneuver targeting the Axis flanks north and south of Stalingrad. The attack, executed with overwhelming force and precise timing, shattered the Romanian lines and closed around the German Sixth Army. Within days, over 250,000 Axis troops were surrounded. Hitler refused to allow a breakout, ordering Paulus to hold at all costs. The Luftwaffe attempted to resupply the pocket by air, but it was an impossible task. Food, ammunition, and medicine ran out as winter descended. The Wehrmacht's greatest strategic error had now culminated in disaster. The Battle of Stalingrad was no longer a tactical engagement. It was the pivot upon which the Eastern Front would turn. The failure of Operation Blue, rooted in flawed objectives and reckless overextension, marked the true end of German offensive dominance. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would increasingly fight on the defensive, trying to hold what it had taken rather than expand further. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, had demonstrated its capacity not only to resist but to plan, adapt, and strike back. The lessons of 1941 had been internalized, and in the crucible of 1942, the Red Army had begun to emerge as a modern, disciplined, and formidable fighting force. The tide was turning, and with it, the long trajectory of the war. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in November 1942 was not just a military catastrophe. It was a psychological and strategic turning point in the entire war. Operation Uranus, executed with precision and overwhelming force, had completely reversed the dynamics on the Eastern Front. For the first time, a major German field army was not just defeated but trapped, with no viable path to escape. Hitler's refusal to authorize a breakout, despite repeated requests from his generals, sealed their fate. The Luftwaffe's attempts to supply the pocket from the air proved woefully inadequate. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was starving, freezing, and collapsing from within. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the German forces in Stalingrad capitulated. Over 90,000 Axis troops surrendered, including General Paulus himself, the first German field marshal to be captured alive, having disobeyed Hitler's implicit order to die rather than surrender. This defeat was not only the largest single loss of troops in the war for Germany, but it also shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. News of the surrender spread rapidly, demoralizing Axis forces and emboldening Soviet soldiers across the front. The repercussions of Stalingrad were immediate and far-reaching. The Germans had not only lost a key city and a powerful army, they had also forfeited the strategic initiative in the East. For the first time since June 1941, it was the Red Army that dictated the tempo of operations. Soviet planners, having demonstrated their ability to organize large-scale multi-arm offensives, now began to pursue broader counteroffensive strategies aimed at rolling back the German presence from all key sectors of the front. In the weeks following the German surrender, the Soviets launched additional operations, including Operation Little Saturn, which targeted Italian forces on the Don River and led to the collapse of Axis lines along much of the southern front. The German command scrambled to stabilize the situation, withdrawing units from the Caucasus and reassigning divisions from quieter sectors to plug the growing gaps. Army Group A's hasty retreat from the Caucasus marked a humiliating reversal of the ambitious drive toward the oil fields. The grand goals of 1942 had been decisively abandoned. At the same time, partisan warfare in the German rear intensified dramatically. Encouraged by the Soviet success at Stalingrad, local resistance movements grew bolder. Supply lines were sabotaged, railways destroyed, and administrative centers attacked. The German army now faced a two-front war within the Soviet Union itself, against organized military units in the field and against decentralized insurgents operating in the rear. This dual threat drained manpower and forced high command to devote elite combat units to anti-partisan operations. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, already stretched to the breaking point, began to show signs of collapse. Fuel shortages became chronic, forcing commanders to prioritize the deployment of armor and aircraft. Maintenance backlogs worsened, and replacement equipment from Germany could not keep pace with losses. Compounding the crisis, the Red Army had gained significant experience in disrupting German logistics, targeting bridges, depots, and rail junctions with artillery and airstrikes. Despite these growing problems, Hitler remained convinced that a decisive German victory was still possible. In March 1943, he ordered a counterattack near Kharkov, which briefly succeeded in retaking the city and stabilizing the front. Spearheaded by SS Panzer divisions under Field Marshal Manstein, the operation showed that the Wehrmacht could still deliver powerful blows. However, this victory was fleeting. The counteroffensive consumed critical resources and did nothing to alter the broader strategic balance. The Red Army continued to grow in strength, while Germany's industrial output was increasingly strained by Allied bombing and mounting casualties. The political implications of the defeat at Stalingrad rippled across Europe. In Germany, the Nazi leadership intensified propaganda efforts to maintain public morale, portraying the fallen Sixth Army as martyrs and emphasizing the danger of Bolshevism. But privately, trust in Hitler's military judgment began to erode within the officer corps. Several senior commanders began to question the wisdom of his direct interference in operations and the rigid no-retreat policy that had led to the destruction of one of Germany's finest armies. Among Germany's allies, confidence in ultimate victory waned. Italy, Hungary, and Romania all suffered heavy losses in the Stalingrad campaign and began reconsidering their positions in the Axis alliance. While formal withdrawals would not occur until later, the sense of inevitability regarding a protracted and losing war began to set in. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was now increasingly confident and internationally recognized as the power holding the Eastern Front. On the battlefield, the Red Army continued to evolve. Mechanized warfare, once a German advantage, was now being mastered by Soviet commanders. Deep battle doctrine, combining massed armor, infantry, artillery, and air support, was refined into a devastating tool. Soviet offensives grew in complexity and coordination, while logistical planning vastly improved. The massive Soviet rail network, rebuilt and expanded during the first years of war, ensured steady supplies and troop movements to key sectors. In preparation for the expected German summer offensive of 1943, Soviet engineers and laborers constructed vast defensive belts along critical sectors, especially near the city of Kursk. Mines, trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified gun positions were laid out in depth. Stalin and his generals anticipated that Hitler, stung by the humiliation at Stalingrad, would attempt to strike a decisive blow to regain the initiative. The stage was being set for what would become the largest tank battle in history, and for the final reversal of fortunes that would push Germany onto a permanent defensive. The events following Stalingrad made it clear. The German war machine, though still dangerous and formidable, was no longer unstoppable. The Soviet Union had absorbed the most powerful assault in modern history and survived. In doing so, it had reshaped the war, revealing the fatal flaws in Hitler's strategic thinking and the limits of German military power. The question was no longer whether Germany could win in the East. It was how long it could hold on. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 marked the final decisive turning point of the Eastern Front, solidifying the irreversible shift in momentum toward the Soviet Union. After the catastrophic losses at Stalingrad and the strategic collapse in the Caucasus, Hitler pinned his hopes on a concentrated offensive to reassert German control. Codenamed Operation Citadel, the plan called for a pincer attack on the Kursk salient, where Soviet forces had extended their lines to form a massive bulge around the city. The objective was simple in theory: encircle and destroy the Soviet forces within the salient and regain the initiative. In practice, it would become a desperate gamble. The German command amassed a vast concentration of armor and troops for the operation, nearly 900,000 men, over 2,700 tanks, and thousands of aircraft. New weapons, including the long-anticipated Tiger and Panther tanks, were introduced with high expectations, though many were still untested or plagued by mechanical issues. Yet, while Hitler delayed the start of the offensive to wait for these new machines to be deployed in sufficient numbers, the Soviet Union was not idle. Intelligence gathered from multiple sources, spies, reconnaissance, and radio intercepts, made clear where and when the attack would fall. Soviet preparations began months in advance. Under the direction of General Zhukov and the Stavka, the Red Army constructed an immense series of defensive lines, some up to 300 kilometers deep. These included minefields, anti-tank obstacles, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements, all laid out in layered echelons designed to absorb and bleed German forces over time. Soviet troops dug in, reinforced positions, and coordinated plans for a counteroffensive once the German thrust was blunted. Kursk was not just a trap. It was a battlefield designed to destroy the last great German offensive capacity in the East. Operation Citadel commenced on July 5, 1943, with a massive German artillery bombardment and airstrikes. Initial gains were made, particularly in the southern sector under General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. The terrain, however, was unforgiving. German tanks advanced slowly through thick minefields and came under constant artillery and air attack. In the north, the German 9th Army under General Model met fierce resistance and made little progress. Soviet defenders held their lines with discipline, sacrificing thousands of lives to buy time and space. The climax came at the Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12th, one of the largest tank engagements in history. Waves of Soviet T-34s clashed head-on with German Tigers and Panthers in chaotic, close-range combat. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the Soviet Union had reserves, while German replacements were scarce. The offensive ground to a halt within days. Facing counterattacks on other fronts and the Allied invasion of Sicily, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. marking the first time a major German offensive had been abandoned before reaching its objective. In the wake of the failed offensive, the Red Army launched a sweeping counteroffensive. Operation Kutuzov targeted the Orel salient north of Kursk, and Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev drove toward Kharkov in the south. Both operations regained key cities and forced German units into full retreat. Unlike the hesitant and fragmented Soviet offensives of earlier years, these campaigns demonstrated a new level of coordination and strategic depth. The Red Army was now capable of sustained, multi-axis operations that overwhelmed German defenses by sheer scale and operational cunning. Meanwhile, the cost to the Wehrmacht was staggering. The best remaining panzer divisions were gutted. The Luftwaffe, having committed vast air power to Kursk, was severely weakened. German industry could not keep pace with material losses, and Hitler's insistence on holding territory meant that troops were often left exposed rather than redeployed to critical sectors. Morale among German soldiers plummeted as the illusion of victory faded permanently. The retreat that followed Kursk would not be a temporary setback. It marked the beginning of a continuous westward collapse. Soviet gains extended well beyond the battlefield. Victory at Kursk emboldened the population and solidified Stalin's grip over both military and political spheres. Soviet industry, now reaching peak output, provided the Red Army with abundant tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The concept of deep battle, where multiple layers of attack operated in succession to dislocate and overwhelm the enemy, was no longer theoretical. Soviet commanders employed it to stunning effect, exploiting breakthroughs and pursuing retreating Germans with relentless pressure. The ideological contrast also sharpened. While Nazi propaganda still proclaimed a struggle against Bolshevism and racial enemies, Soviet messaging emphasized liberation, vengeance, and national survival. In many areas, Soviet forces were welcomed, especially by populations brutalized under German occupation. At the same time, Stalin's regime intensified efforts to consolidate power, reassert control over recaptured territories, and punish perceived collaborators. The Soviet state was no longer merely surviving, it was rebuilding and expanding its reach. The impact on the German home front was profound. Stalingrad had shaken the public. Kursk extinguished hope of a return to the offensive. Faith in the Nazi leadership eroded quietly, even among loyalists. The loss of so many experienced soldiers, coupled with the increasing demand for total war mobilization, began to stretch German society to its limits. Allied bombing campaigns intensified, and whispers of inevitable defeat grew louder in military circles. From the perspective of the Eastern Front, Kursk marked the end of German strategic initiative. Never again would the Wehrmacht launch a major offensive in the East. For the Soviet Union, it marked the moment when defense gave way to sustained, aggressive expansion. Every German retreat from this point would be followed by Soviet pursuit. The vision of a Nazi empire stretching to the Urals had died in the fields of Kursk. What remained was a bitter, protracted struggle, one the Red Army was now better positioned to win with every passing month. By the end of 1943, the failure of the German invasion of the Soviet Union had become undeniable. What began in June 1941 as a campaign of rapid conquest had unraveled into a war of attrition Germany could no longer afford. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military machine in Europe, was bleeding strength across an increasingly unstable Eastern Front. The Red Army, revitalized by victory, industrial recovery, and a maturing command structure, was no longer reacting. It was dictating the course of the war. What followed in 1944 and 1945 was not a series of isolated defeats for Germany, but a comprehensive collapse rooted in the very foundations of the original campaign. The Soviet offensives of 1944, beginning with Operation Bagration in the summer, demonstrated the full maturation of Soviet operational art. Coordinated across multiple fronts, with overwhelming superiority in manpower, artillery, armor, and air power, these operations annihilated Army Group Center and drove the Germans from Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of Ukraine. The speed and scope of Soviet advances shocked even Allied observers. The Red Army was now conducting complex operations with precision and confidence, exploiting every weakness in the German defense and maintaining relentless momentum. Germany, meanwhile, was caught in a tightening vice. In the west, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were advancing through France. In Italy, a second front dragged on with heavy German casualties. In the air, Allied bombing campaigns devastated German industry, transportation, and morale. On the Eastern Front, Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals led to encirclements and needless losses. Army groups were shattered and reformed, only to be destroyed again. Replacement troops, increasingly drawn from older men, youth, and foreign auxiliaries, could not match the combat effectiveness of the veteran formations lost earlier. In the occupied territories, the consequences of the German invasion lingered in blood and ruin. Millions of Soviet civilians had perished through mass executions, starvation policies, and slave labor. Entire towns had been destroyed. The retreating Wehrmacht practiced scorched earth tactics, burning villages, destroying infrastructure, and deporting civilians. The devastation inflicted on the Soviet Union was unparalleled, but instead of breaking its will, it hardened Soviet resolve. For every village destroyed, 10 more dug in. The idea that the USSR would collapse under pressure proved to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in modern military history. The German leadership failed to grasp that the war they launched was unwinnable under their chosen conditions. Operation Barbarossa was based on ideological delusions, beliefs in racial superiority, the supposed inferiority of Slavs, and the fragility of the Soviet state. These assumptions informed every critical decision, from the brutal occupation policies that sparked mass resistance to the disregard for the scale of Soviet resources and the capacity of its people to endure suffering. The invasion failed not simply because of weather or logistics, but because its goals were divorced from military reality and rooted in ideological fantasy. Stalin's Soviet Union, while far from benevolent, proved ruthlessly efficient in mobilizing its vast population and resources. The centralization of power allowed for rapid decisions and harsh discipline. The evacuation of industry east of the Urals, the integration of women into the workforce, and the relentless propaganda machine all contributed to total war mobilization.